Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we conclude with Part 2, Are Other Planets Inhabited? By Manly P. Hall, an article taken from PRS Journal, Volume 18, Number 4, Spring 1959. Are Other Planets Inhabited? Part 2, by Manly P. Hall. The next point that we have to consider is that we are living in a universe in which there may be other degrees of attainment than our own. If we assume that these other planets are also fields of evolution, they form a ladder constituting degrees from a lesser to a greater state. Therefore, there is an orderly concatenation of ascent, in which the relationship of each planet is superior to that less than itself and inferior to that greater than itself. Thus, it would be reasonable to conclude that the degree of attainment of some planets would be less than ours, while that of others would be greater than ours. Those forms of life which are inferior to our own, we may assume to be equally limited as ourselves, or to have less of knowledge, understanding, growth, security, and certainly less of sensory power than ourselves. Let us consider a comparable situation on our Earth. Looking upon the world around us, we can say that the animal is spiritually, psychically, and eternally no less than ourselves. In the degree of its attained power or ability to manifest its own potential, however, it is less than ourselves. It is less because if it were greater, it would have conquered us. It is less because it lacks the tremendous organizing power which we have as rational beings. Thus we know that man is an animal that can build cities and can dream of a better state. By these dreams and achievements, he has conquered the other lesser kingdoms around him. This conquest does not mean, however, the right of extermination or perversion. It simply means that man, because he knows more, could do more for the common good of all. In the family of planets, a similar situation may exist. It is very doubtful, for example, that the peoples or creatures of other planets would be able to have any dynamic effect upon us. If they are less than we are, it is very likely that they too have not yet mastered space. So the question arises, in this great pattern of things, where are we? Are we at the bottom, or at the top, or at the middle? How much do we have to fear from superiors, and how much good could we do for those inferior to ourselves? From the time of Pythagoras on down, there is a long tradition relating to our place in this great order of planetary life. The Chinese, the Hindus, the Greeks, and the Egyptians all came to approximately the same conclusion. Namely, our planetary evolution is somewhere near the center of the scale. In other words, we occupy a degree of culture that is superior to that of certain others and inferior to that of some. This problem becomes very complicated because we must then make the effort to determine the total concept of relationships. Are we in a situation in which we have to compare a large apple and a small orange? Are these other planets so completely different that even comparison is impossible? Would it be like trying to compare a small but absolutely mature cherry with a very much larger but unripe watermelon, and trying to determine which is the best and the more important? The ancients decided that comparison between planets is not incongruous for one reason. The sun is the root of a tree, and this solar system is a tree bearing fruit. Therefore, all of the fruits belonging to the tree have one source of life and one archetypal nature. Actually, we are dealing with the different degrees of growth of one type of life, and these degrees of growth remind us that what constitutes this difference is also in our own cells. For the human being consists of 7 different parts, each with its own peculiar and special requirements. These various parts of man are also in different degrees of their own development. For example, although the heart and liver are the same age in the body of the human being, in the evolution of organs and functions they are not of equal ancientness, nor are the sensory perceptions equally ancient, for each has developed and unfolded in its own time. Therefore, some are much older than others and more universal. Some are much more restricted. Some appear to have almost used up their value to us and have a tendency to diminish. Thus, even within ourselves, various organs, functions, and powers are in youth, maturity, and age, according to the uses and areas in which they are involved. This being conceivable and, according to the archetypal pattern of our own experience, sustained by analogy upon our own planet, I think we may with reasonable intelligence affirm that the various planets represent degrees of the development of a kind of life. This kind of life is itself a septenary, and these different sections, or elements, of this one grand life pattern have been specialized. Each of these specializations has its own environment and its own level. Perhaps ultimately, and actually the solar system as a total, will be finally available to all of its citizens without discrimination or restrictions. Such a totality would be possible because each citizen possesses within himself the powers of all the planets, as well as faculties which these planets sustain, enrich, and affect. This may ultimately show us why astrology, which shows the influence of other bodies upon parts of our body, may be vindicated. We will discover that we have bridges within ourselves between this world and others, and it is because of these bridges that the whole solar system is a complete structure. This would further sustain the belief of the ancients that Saturn was the begetter, because Saturn, in man, rules the bones, the basic construction upon which all other things are added. From Hogarth's Works, 1827, a satirical engraving by William Hogarth. In the various teachings, then, we have these different levels, and in our time, these are of great concern to us. We wonder, and we are to a measure upset, about the possibilities that persons or beings from these other levels may invade us, move in upon us, and participate, with or without our permission, in the affairs of our planet. There is nothing to deny such a possibility in the case of those forms of life which are sufficiently similar to our own to be able to function in our way of life. It would be improbable, however, that forms of life essentially inferior to ourselves would be able to achieve any of the major ends that man has not attained. This does not mean that such forms of life could not excel us in some specialized phases of development. Again, we can draw a parallel with life on our own planet. Man, for example, is the summit of a series of kingdoms on the earth. In these kingdoms, which are less developed than man, there are specialized attainments which may excel him. Thus, man cannot fly unaided as the bird does. He has not the strength of the elephant or the gorilla, or the swiftness of the deer. Nor can he remain underwater and live, like the fish, unless he uses mechanical devices. Yet although man can be excelled by kingdoms less than himself in certain details, he excels these kingdoms in one faculty, his power of thought. It is this power of thought which gradually organizes the resources of a planet. If, therefore, the power of intellection or of individualized mental existence on another planet is less than man's, it would not be reasonable to assume that the beings on this planet might so excel him that they could fly here or build devices which would reach here. For above all of these natural attainments must come intellectual integration. Again, the bird may fly farther than man, but lacking intellectual directive, it has no desire to go anywhere. Consequently, I think we may affirm that any visitors that conceivably could reach us from other planets would have to equal us on some level of attainment, and also, and particularly, in intellection. In other words, they would have to have some power by means of which ambition, purpose, determination, inquiry, examination, perhaps even scientific programming, might cause some interest in this situation. Also, it would be affirmed that such an achievement would naturally have to arise in evolution, and therefore must have its root in a consistent preceding program, unfolding over a period of experimental research there, as it must here. It is evident that we have different faculties and perspectives to work with, but in the totality of things, we must assume that faculties or powers must be available, and that these faculties must result from the ensouling of form by consciousness. This ensouling must result from form itself having attained a degree of refinement and responsiveness in which it is capable of adequately manifesting this unsouled life. The general thinking, then, would be that visitors from other planets would have to be within the gamut of being able to exist in the kind of world that we have. They would have to have the moral, mental, emotional, psychical, or spiritual incentive to come here. They must have had sufficient evolutionary progress to be able to develop, manufacture, and complete the means of getting here. Up to the present time, our own thinking is such that, for the most part, we assume that these visitors will arrive by some kind of mechanical means. This method may be superior to our own, but is only a development or projection of our own speculations into something more advanced than we have yet actually attained. From this, we would infer that such visitation must come from planets very close to our own in consciousness, growth, and purposes. We must assume the presence of many attributes like our own, or the entire program would be meaningless. If we were dealing with another planet on which nobody wanted to go anywhere else, we would be unable to estimate it, simply because it would be different psychologically from our own concept. It has always been held by mystics and metaphysicians generally, as well as some scientists along these lines, that in all probability, the only two planets whose inhabitants would be likely to be able to reach us, or would want to reach us, would be Mars and Venus. These could conceivably have a development of mechanical devices that could be suitable to our atmosphere, our way of life, or our dimensions of space. These two have sufficiently similar relationships to the universe so that we might conceive of them as being compatible. We have absolutely no way of knowing with anything resembling rational certainty the conditions of life upon these planets. If the theories of the ancient astrologers and mystics have some validity, and these planets do have keynotes, we might assume that the planet Mars would be associated with a martial type of life. It would therefore be aggressive and violent, or at least strong, decisive, explorative, scientific, and have certain powerful ambitional factors. Venus we would assume to be a more gracious, subtle, sensitive type of planet. If there be any truth to the astrological key delineations, Venus would therefore be a cultural, aesthetic, paradisiacal type of sphere. These theories we can support only out of the general psychic life of our race, which has come to such conclusions about these things. Assuming that the beings on these two planets could be within the gamut of availability, that they could conceivably create devices upon our level, that is, devices visible or knowable to us, how then could we explain the possibility of space travel by them? We would have to assume that these beings were of a higher order of general evolution and ingenuity than ourselves. We would have to assume it on the grounds that no single device or invention can stand alone. The Babylonian man could not have invented the automobile. The ancient Egyptian could not have invented television, because before these things could come, great sequences of preparatory material had to be developed. Therefore, a people capable of attaining space travel, which we have not yet attained, must have had some form of specialized attainment. We are naturally inclined to raise the question of whether some of these people might be soulless, whether they might be simply brigands in space, the deadly enemies of life, or whether they may have sold themselves to some cosmic devil and hate all life from then on. It seems to me that all such speculations are unfounded, for the reason, as previously mentioned, that we cannot imagine that the immortal and inevitable power which sustains all life can permit death within life. We cannot conceive that this life power can be so limited that it can lose ultimate control of any part of its creation. For this creation can escape nowhere. It can never get away. It can never depart. A planet like Ragnarok may be broken into asteroids, but it cannot disappear. Nothing can die in a universe in which there is nothing but life. Therefore, forms can change, civilizations can be audacious, Atlantean cultures can rise and fall, but life cannot cease. And where there is life, the great archetype of good is indestructible. Thus, we cannot conceive that any life is primarily bad. We may conceive that some cultures might be more aggressive or more militant than our own, but any power superior to ourselves should be superior to our thoughts. Anything which knows more than we do must know what we have not yet learned, namely, that no one can win a war. Any form of life that has greater internal spiritual integrity than our own and is therefore able to accomplish things we cannot do must also have a greater knowledge of universal laws and principles. Therefore, while at some time or other, like nations, it may become aggressive, dictatorial, or even militaristic, it cannot ultimately attain to its own maturity without outgrowing those limitations against which we are struggling. As to worlds beyond Mars and Venus, we might mention that the ancients believed that the greater planets, such as Jupiter and Saturn, and perhaps even those further out, have always had contact with the Earth. We learn also in our great scriptural writings that the races and orders of life from the moon finally moved to the Earth, leaving this luminary in the state of a so-called desert world. It is stated that at the dawn of time, beings from Saturn and Jupiter did reach the Earth, and that in ancient times, the powers of Venus came to the Earth and left the banana and the wheat behind them. The ancients believed that there was communication in primitive time between this planet and other planets, but that this communication consisted in the spiritual power of the beings from these other planets to project themselves by will, by the mysterious power of consciousness itself, in the same way that man can project his total consciousness to awareness of any part of his own body. Beings essentially superior are also termed hierarchies, and these beings become the teachers and guides and leaders. It was believed that in ancient times such guidance and such leadership did exist, but that gradually man himself came into the control and direction of his own planet. It was further believed that there are forms of life on every planet which are links between it and all the other members of the system, but that finally man himself must, within his own nature, communicate with that which is superior to himself. If he wishes to communicate with that inferior to himself, he must, by his own efforts, project his consciousness downward into the specialized fields of his interest. Thus, man may study forms of life inferior to himself, but those forms of life superior to himself he can only experience receptively. Therefore, in a mysterious way, man can aggressively examine the lesser, but must receptively accept the greater. And through his own equilibrium, in relation to all these things, he will ultimately and unquestionably come to understand his solar system, with its parts and fragments, and recognize his kinship with the great orders of life that surround him in space. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.